The question tonight is part of the overall theme, which is the impact of the industrialization of the two-thirds of the world that were formerly poor on the rest of us, and is there a shortage of spending power? As recently as 1990, the Chinese saved $153 billion a year and accounted for less than 1% of the world's savings. This year they will save $4.5 trillion and account for 25% of the world's savings. In the last 8 years, China's savings have leapt from a tenth of the world's savings to a quarter. What I want to consider today is whether this and the industrialization of the emerging economies more generally means that there's a world problem of excess savings and underconsumption, and if so, what that means. One of the consequences that I'll look at more closely is the extent to which the savings glut was responsible for the mistaken decisions that led to the financial crisis, which started in 2007, and the aftermath of which lingers today. I'll suggest some measures by which we can cope better with the aftermath of the financial crisis. Though my key message is that when you've made such disastrous mistakes of investor decision-making, regulation, and government economic policy, you do have to pay the price. And it was always unrealistic to expect a rapid recovery. And indeed, the main people who thought that were only government economists. I will look at some of the other consequences, like the extent to which China will accumulate assets abroad, and I'll also look at the impact of investing for retirement. We're going to start by putting this lecture in the context of the others in the series, and we move to looking at how high savings ratios have actually been in China and how this has affected the world's savings rate. We then move on to how this contributed to the financial crisis and what could be done to alleviate the situation. We will then look at the misuse of Keynesian remedies, which made the economic crisis so much worse than it needed to be by finding a false rationale for boosting public spending in the upswing. Then we will turn to the impact of the Chinese savings glut on pensions, and then to the ownership of assets. And finally, I bring a postscript which comments on the economic issue of the day, which is the UK's loss of its AAA rating, with the help of some economic analysis done by one of my colleagues at CEBR. How does this fit into the overall lecture series? Well, the series examines the impact of globalization on the Western world. And in the past 4 lectures, we've looked at the unprecedented pace at which the emerging economies have emerged, at the super competitiveness of some of these economies, at their impact on natural resource prices and inflation, at new theories of economic growth that we need to guide policy in the Western economies, and at some practical issues like the need to restructure the costs of living and of doing business in the Western world to make ourselves competitive, and especially to do so in the UK. Now let me turn first to the scale of Chinese savings. Now this chart shows gross savings ratios last year. I should just give you a technical note here, which is gross savings ratios are GDP minus public and private consumption. That's the technical definition. And it includes savings made by households, by corporates, and by governments. So it's the combination of those. And it's the most comprehensive definition of savings and the most useful one for the purpose that we're looking at, which is to see whether there is a glut of such savings. Now you'll see that the shape of the chart is slightly affected by the first rule in how to lie with economic statistics, which is that the graph is foreshortened by cutting it off at 10%. So if you really want to get a slightly more accurate picture, just shift the axis in your mind very slightly to the left. And what you will see is that traditional large economies have had savings ratios to GDP of about 15%, the UK a bit below that, the US just about there, or 20%, which is more typically the European ratio. But if we look at China, the ratio is 50%, or was 50% last year. Households in China account for about half of this, and the rest is mainly provided by corporations. Chinese companies typically make very large profits, but equally typically, they have more than one set of books, and they do not declare most of these profits. And these profits are typically saved, and these black profits are typically invested in property, which is why quite often they're perfectly happy to own complete blocks of flats that are completely empty, which is a bit of an abomination if you think about it, when we in Britain are so short of living space. Western economists have typically predicted that the Chinese savings ratio will fall. If you talk to anyone in the BBC or the FT or the Treasury, the people who normally get it wrong, you will discover that's the sort of thing they keep on telling you. Well, this graph shows you what, in comparison with their forecasts, actually has happened, which is it hasn't gone down, it's gone up. And even though the right-hand bit of the chart, which contains our forecast out to 2017, suggests it might fall, that's simply a forecast. And as you know, forecasts are sometimes right, particularly when we make them, but they're not always right. So that's what it is showing. Now, the only country with a savings ratio anywhere near it, as you can tell from the previous chart, is Singapore. Even Japan, which is famous for its high savings, is now closer to the developed country norm. As I pointed out in my first Gresham lecture, Chinese GDP, after remaining about 2% of world GDP for most of the 80s and into the early 90s, has since started to move sharply upwards, reached 4% of world GDP around about the year 2000, and it's now 12% of world GDP. And it's forecast to continue to rise towards 15% by 2017. Now, those who are good at multiplication will know that the combination of a 50% savings ratio with a GDP of 12% of world GDP means that Chinese savings are currently 6% of world GDP, which is indeed what the number is, going up towards 7. And in cash terms, that gives the figures that I quoted at the beginning of the lecture a rise from 153 billion in 1980 to $4.5 trillion today, and a forecast $6.5 trillion in 2017. It's quite instructive. This is the chart that I discovered I'd lost and had to replace for those who watched me fiddling around before the lecture started. It's quite instructive to compare savings in the US and in China. The US still has a much larger economy than China, though not for long, but it has a low savings ratio. China, with a relatively smaller GDP but a much higher savings ratio, had a level of savings which overtook the US in 2007. But since then, it's risen dramatically and has already reached double the US level and is forecast to rise further. Now, China provides a quarter of the world's saving, while the US provides 12%. And of course, the Chinese savings glut can only affect the world's supply of savings if it causes a rise in the world's savings ratio. And it has. In the 80s and 90s, the world's savings ratio fluctuated around 22%. But since 2001, the trend has been sharply upwards to just shy of 25% now, and is forecast to continue to rise. Now, you might wonder what effect it has on interest rates. Well, this chart shows you. This gives you the benchmark US 10-year Treasury bond, the yield on it. It yielded round about 6% at the beginning of the century, fallen to between 2 and 3% in 2010. The yield yesterday was 1.87%. So what this means is the impact of Chinese savings on the world savings rate is now on a scale that affects other economies significantly by pushing down world interest rates. Now let me turn to the financial crisis. The basic story is actually pretty well known. Investors took on excess risk, bankrupting many banks and building societies. In the UK, the two banks that had to be bailed out were the Royal Bank of Scotland and Lloyds HBOS, although in fact it was only the HBOS part that was really in trouble until Lloyds took it over. I was actually at the party where Gordon Brown allegedly approached Victor Blank, then chairman of Lloyds Bank, no longer, and started the process of spreading the crisis to Lloyds Bank as well. Clever man. Amongst the building societies and former building societies, you have Northern Rock, Bradford and Bingley, and the Dunfermline Building Society, whose record of mismanagement was such that it's hard to believe that they didn't take advice from their local MP. What is interesting about this is that in the UK, the so-called casino banks were not, in fact, the ones that got into trouble. It was the retail banks with investment arms and the building societies and former building societies. It's also notable that the further north a bank or building society was headquartered, the more likely it was to go bust. The only exception was Aberdeen Asset Management, although even they had some problems with their split cap schemes, but they managed to get through that one. Despite the fact that no businesses in the city needed to be bailed out by the government, politicians have stigmatized the city as the cause of the problem. Now, I beg to take a slightly contrarian view on this. I think, in fact, that the city is pretty good at making risky investments, or if they make bad investments, making sure that it's the people who invested through them rather than they themselves who get bankrupted. Its people are pretty clever and work extremely hard, although, of course, they are, or at least used to be, over-remunerated. But that's not the point. The real problems in the financial economy have come when the Robins of the clearing banks tried to become the Batman of the investment banks. When I was at school, people used to be pointed towards working in the clearing banks when they were considered to be not quite bright enough to go and work in the to go into the armed forces. Partly because no one would ever have thought of sending these people to university. They tended to know their limitations and actually were often rather good bankers. They made up in understanding people for what they lacked in IQ and generally understood their customers easily well enough to know whether to lend to them or not. They have been replaced by people who probably don't rank much higher in terms of ability, but have been sent to university and have aspirations that exceed their capabilities. When those working in the city started to make real money, others in clearing banks, without either the intellectual ability or the access to market knowledge to take the same risks, asked, why not me too? And with the financial power of the clearing banks behind them, they could take on even bigger risks without having any of the ability to understand them. The other elements of the crisis in the UK were either lax or incompetent regulation of financial bodies, exacerbated by the split of the powers of the Bank of England, with banking regulation hived off to the infamous Financial Services Authority, and the emergence of a massive public sector deficit and burgeoning debt ratio. This looks, at face value, like a case of bad behaviour by bankers and politicians, and indeed it was. But of course, with their superior access to the means of manipulating public opinion, politicians have been able to pass most of the blame over to the bankers, who were already unpopular because they were overpaid. However, if you look underneath the surface, the problem really starts with the glut of Chinese savings. This caused the fall in interest rates and hence investment yields. The difficulty was that the yields that the main institutional investors targeted were based on historic data. The Financial Services Authority guidance on yields that people were expected to target, even as late as 2007, showed target medium-term yields of between 3.75% and 8.75%, and it was based on research by a firm called PricewaterhouseCoopers. I do have to declare an interest because I actually tendered for the same contract that PwC won, and obviously I didn't. But I did get a very kind letter from Sir Howard Davis, who was the head of the FSA, who explained I hadn't been selected because he wanted the involvement of actuaries. Now, when you lose a contract, it's no more worth arguing the point than it is if the referee gives a penalty against you. All that happens if you argue is you get a yellow card as well. You may get sent off. So I didn't carry on with the argument. But my main observation is that whenever you hear the suggestion that actuaries should get involved in something, your heart should sink. In my view, it was a major error, since actuaries will normally only look backwards and do not have the understanding necessary to see the changing economic forces that mean that the future may not be like the past. The yields that the FSA were encouraging investors to target for government bonds as recently as 2007 were actually more than double the current yields that are actually being achieved. Now, the problem of low yields is exacerbated by a second failing of the actuaries. Sorry to be rude about them. I hope none of the people here are actuaries. Thank you, sir. Well, there'll be a question time at the end. This failing, no, you can get your own back. This second failing has fewer extenuating circumstances, which is that they've grossly failed to predict the scale of the increase in longevity. And this has led to pension funds, which make up the largest single component of the investment community, being underfunded for direct benefit schemes. The underprediction of the increases in longevity and the failure of yields to live up to expectations as a result of the savings belt jointly caused ill-informed Western investors to invest in ever riskier asset classes to try and chase target yields which were based on the experience of a different era. If you think about it, why on earth would anyone buy subprime mortgage debt? Surely the clue was in the name. Subprime means that the borrowers have bad credit records. And bad credit records means that on past trends they're unlikely to repay. The slick salesman trying to palm off subprime mortgage bonds claimed that by reslicing and dicing the mortgage portfolios, they could manage the risk. Now, anyone who knows a little bit about statistics would know that this is a pretty implausible assertion, because the risk has to go somewhere unless you actually remove it. If it hasn't been removed, it's still in there somewhere and bound to come out at some point. But actually, the system of lending that took place in the US meant that default was insured. Most of the mortgages were sold to subprime buyers on a rising scale of interest rates. Initial interest payments were low, about 2% roughly. Even then, about a fifth were unable to service their repayments even in the first year, which is a pretty high default rate, really. But the interest rates were scheduled to rise, and after about 6 years were typically meant to rise to about 10%. And this guaranteed that subprime borrowers, who are not the richest of people, would not meet the repayments in most cases. But even then, the slick salesman had a solution. They rolled the repayments that hadn't been made into increasing the mortgages. Now, of course, you will all understand that this could only possibly work when underlying asset prices continue to rise. But the US housing market is very different from the UK market. The US has a huge land mass and varying but generally relaxed planning rules, And this means that when house prices rise in the US, new house building is induced, which eventually pulls house prices back down again. This makes US house prices very cyclical, without anything like the upward trend that is characterized in the UK, where you have very tight planning rules and a very inelastic supply response when prices go up. That's this persistent supply shortage to which I referred in the last lecture. In turn, this means it's economic madness to bet on house prices rising continually in the United States. It doesn't happen, hasn't happened in history, and didn't happen. So, subprime mortgage bonds were a product that was bound to fail, a fact that should have been obvious to anyone with a reasonable economic knowledge and a grain of common sense. Admittedly, that's a combination that's slightly less ubiquitous than you might expect. As a trustee of the GEC pension scheme and a member of its investment committee, I had the privilege of being present when someone flew over from Boston to try to persuade us to invest in such subprime mortgage bonds in the mid-2000s. The fact he could afford to fly the Atlantic for just one meeting suggested that the profit margins might be quite fancy. And the fact he needed to fly the Atlantic suggested he'd run out of people in the US stupid enough to buy the bonds. Fortunately, I managed to persuade the investment committee not to buy the bonds, so some of the employee representatives seemed quite excited by them. Of course, subprime mortgages were only the tip of the iceberg as far as risky lending and the search for higher nominal yields are concerned. A wide range of risky forms of lending was also encouraged, a whole range of other things. So the low yields caused by the Chinese savings glut were critical in setting up the circumstances for the world financial crisis. Add this to lax monetary policy in the Western world, which was also a response to the Chinese savings glut, and a financial collapse was inevitable, and as duly took place in 2007 and 2008, followed by an economic collapse in 2009. And we're still living with the aftermath. Did we predict the financial crisis? Well, yes, actually, most economists did. The Queen asked the famous question to the London School of Economics. Why didn't economists predict this? It was the right question to ask at the LSE, because I don't think any LSE economists predicted it. But the answer is that most economists working in the real world did predict it. I certainly did, and most of the people working in the city did, which is one of the reasons why the city didn't get its fingers burnt, which is why the city didn't go bust. We failed to predict the scale of the crisis. In my case, I made two mistakes. The first is I didn't predict that bankers would fail to lend to each other. I'd always thought they were pretty dubious people, and I kept my account in healthy overdraft. I didn't want to lend money to them. I was perfectly happy for them to lend money to me. I hadn't realized other people were going to share that prejudice. And the other thing that we missed was the scale of the world inventory adjustment in 2009, which turned out to be much bigger than most of us had forecast. But the fact of the financial crisis, I don't actually know any mainstream economist who wasn't an academic or who didn't work for the government who actually got it wrong. But the academics and the people working for the government were not quite as successful. There were one or two outstanding people who did understand. So the people who got it wrong were those who were a bit remote from the real world, and especially, of course, the Treasury. And one or two people in the media as well. The FT was persistently wrong, and some of the BBC commentary, until Robert Peston started getting on his lugubrious high horse, most of the BBC people messes up as well. Now, obviously now there is a great rush to shut the stable door of financial regulation, with the horse having bolted quite a few fields away. I actually think that the problem with financial services was too much regulation, not too little. When you regulate in too much detail, as the FSA did, you tend to miss the wood for the trees. The FSA were very good at preventing people from tripping up over exposed wires on the floor, but they totally miss the exposure to loss-making subprime mortgages. If you over-regulate, then you end up missing the key points. What you need to do is regulate on what's important and the strategy. We've now actually moved on from the mad world of 2007, 2008. Bonuses have fallen by nearly 90%, and they're now paid at the top end in forms where they're recoverable if deals that look good turn out subsequently to be loss-making. There still are examples of excess pay, but my view is that it's not the pay that's the problem, it's the lack of competition that causes excess profits that allow pay to be excess. That is the problem. And so the way to deal with the problem is to deal with the excess profits, not to deal with the excess pay directly, which is just dealing with the symptom, not the core problem. And by the way, if you deal with the excess profits, you also ensure that the gains are paid over to the customers. So that's what I think you should do. And you can deal with any other aspect of excess pay by transparency and by ensuring that you have decent corporate governance. My approach would be to ensure that we have competition, but then look after the institutions upon which we all depend. We don't want the banks with all our savings to collapse, but take a tough line with individuals. If you're on the board of a bank that needs to be bailed out, or have been in the run-up to the problems emerging, you should not expect to work in the city again. Actually, the first draft of this said you should not expect to walk in the city again. I think kneecapping is probably a bit harsh. It's just a little bit extreme. But this would really focus attention of boards who up until now have been insufficiently critical in their oversight of their executives. On about page 300 of Alistair Darling's memoirs, there's a lovely quote where he said that one of the directors of one of the clearing banks phoned him up to say that they'd had a great change of heart and they decided only to involve themselves in, and only to take on risks that they understood. And this was a major change of heart that came upon them in 2009. 2 years on from the financial crisis, they thought, shall we only take on things we understand now? Amazing. And Alistair Darling, in his rather characteristic way, just writes this, puts this in the memoirs. There's hardly any comment, in a rather laconic way. It's one of the reasons I'm quite a fan of his. The way in which boards can make sure that people don't cut corners, it's essentially to do with corporate culture that you said. Boards can easily make people do what they want, if they want to do so. It's only when they're in the same get-rich-quick mode that they end up with staff working for them who behave in the same way. I also think that in the new world, with much lower yields, we have to adapt the culture of fund management to reflect the reality. In such a climate, those who are investing funds are going to have to take radically lower returns. I believe it's unreasonable to expect to charge 1% or so of a portfolio to manage a fund when the yield is only 3%. So this business model also has to change. And I'm sure consumer pressure will force it because people will not be prepared to pay for that. The Chinese savings glut had another unforeseen consequence. It encouraged some governments, and the UK was actually the worst example, but there are others as well, to expand public spending rapidly, financed by running deficits, and also financed by spending some of the temporary tax revenues that were flowing in from the overextended financial system. For most of the first decade of the 21st century, the UK ran deficits of 30 to 40 billion at a time when we were near the top of the economic cycle. This despite revenues from financial services in the UK of nearly 70 billion, which should have been seen as at least partially temporary and banked for a rainy day. Of course, when the cycle turned down and the financial sector moved from boom to bust, the deficit soared to 159 billion in 2009-10. And as you can see, my people at CBR are very much more sceptical than the government forecasters in the ODR, or Office for Bad Predictions, about the speed at which this will decline. The basis of the heavy spending seemed to be a mistaken version of Keynesian economics. But I write all this stuff with a copy of Keynes's General Theory on my desk, and Keynes's demand stimulus policies were explicitly targeted at emergency and temporary measures for an economy with negative inflation and declining GDP. He never at any point suggested running budget deficits as a long-term fix to offset high savings in another country somewhere else, particularly in an economy that was then growing and an economy that then had positive inflation. He never suggested anything of that kind. And it is not Keynesian, and I am 100% certain that Keynes would never have made such a recommendation. Now, just to give you some indication of the cost of all of this, the problem of bailing out the banks, the cost of Fred Goodwin and his mates, effectively, it will probably, the conventional estimate is the cost is going to turn out to be about 120 billion net after loans have been repaid. There are some government guarantees which potentially could come on stream, but the 120 is now becoming very much the consensus figure, 120 billion. Still a lot of money, actually. But if you compare that, that's the cost of Fred Goodwin. If you compare that with the cost of Gordon Brown, which is the cost of the excess deficits, well, we see these continuing up to 2025, and by then they will have accumulated to 1.5 trillion pounds. So you could say that Gordon Brown is more than 10 times as responsible quantitatively for our crisis as Fred Goodwin. Now, he hasn't got a knighthood to be stripped from him, but I wonder whether other actions should be taken. It's time to stop pretending that all the problems are caused by the bankers. They did cause problems, and yes, indeed, they were overpaid. But it is time now for the politicians to accept that they played a much bigger part, even than the bankers, in creating the national economic crisis. Because of likely slow growth in the UK, our latest forecasts indicate that the debt ratio in 2025 will still be over 70% of GDP, and most economists reckon that anything over 60% is unsustainable. Besides being the main background cause for the financial collapse, the Chinese savings glut had a whole series of other consequences. Let me turn first to pensioners. After getting their fingers burnt with high yield investment, today's investors have reluctantly concluded that low yields are the reality, at least for the time being. And even the pensions regulator admits that most pension schemes are now underfunded, and many will never be able to be fully funded while the low yields persist without bankrupting their guarantors. And for those on direct contribution pension schemes, the annuity yields that they're able to buy are unlikely to rise much from today's very depressed levels. Obviously, what happens in the future depends on the extent to which the Chinese savings ratio falls over time. And I'm pretty certain it will fall over time. But the evidence of the recent past, and indeed the evidence from Singapore, where even now they've passed our level of prosperity, their savings ratio is still over 40%, suggests that even prosperity and time may not on their own be enough to overcome the cultural factors that keep the Chinese savings ratio high. I should work on the assumption that even if it does fall, it takes rather longer and falls rather more slowly than most people expect. We should therefore expect the savings glut to persist for most of the first half of this century at least. In turn, this means that low yields are likely to persist, if probably not quite as low as the yields that we have today, when they're distorted downwards by some specific elements of monetary policy. Now, simple maths shows that current life expectancy trends and low yields mean that you have to save nearly half of pre-tax income to retire at the age of 65 on 2/3 of your former salary. Now, in response to this, workers could save more, but of course, if they did so en masse, it would exacerbate the problem of excess savings. So that isn't actually a solution en masse, although for an individual it can be. But in reality, the only proper solution that works en masse is for people to work longer. Now, Japanese men who faced the problem early because of zero interest rates and declining population, they now retire on average at the age of 70 and will retire even later in future. Their retirement age is rising by between 2 and 3 years every 10 years. Our calculation is that those joining the labour force in the UK today at around the age of 20 will probably have to work until the age of 75 or even longer. So that's just something to think about if you're around the age of 20 and not already retired. A second impact of the high savings ratio is a country that provides 25% of the world's savings, unless it invests spectacularly badly or spectacularly well, is probably going to end up with 25% of the world's assets. And Chinese share of world GDP is about 12%. In time when growth slows, the Chinese share of world assets will also therefore be probably proportional to its share of world GDP. So with a savings ratio that's double the world's savings ratio, the probability is that half of Chinese savings will eventually have to end up overseas. Now, so far they've invested heavily in areas that the West has neglected, like Africa and South America. It's also invested very heavily in US treasury bonds. But they will increasingly have to turn to other assets, like companies and properties in the West, including UK companies. So my second bit of advice to someone in their 20s, besides preparing to work to their 75, is that their next boss may be Chinese. And so they better start learning Mandarin. So in this lecture, we've seen the consequences of China's extraordinary savings ratio as the Chinese economy becomes a very significant part of the world economy. The scale is such that it affects the way we all live our lives and will particularly affect the lives led by the next few generations. I'd like to finish with a postscript, some calculations done by one of my colleagues, Chitraj Singh Channa, who is somewhere at the back with his hand up, waving to you. He stopped waving. Right. Which casts light on why it's so difficult for the UK economy to grow, and which in turn gives an important explanation of why one of the ratings agencies has reduced the UK's credit rating. The graph I'm showing shows the difference between world GDP growth using the normal current price weighting and the numbers you would get if you weighted the different countries in the world by their share of UK export markets to get your world growth. Now, historically, you can see that these have moved in line, but no longer. The gap between world growth and growth in our export markets is a major reason why it's so difficult to get the UK to grow. World growth is orientated in more senses than one, to China and the Far East, but our exports are still orientated, just in one sense, towards Europe, even if the EU share has now dropped just below 50%. Now, it's the line at the top, the red line, the rate of world economic growth, which drives up the prices of commodities, of fuel, and of energy. It's the blue line at the bottom, which drives up our exports and hence drives up our GDP. Our living standards are depressed by rising costs of food, fuel, raw materials, etc., while our exports are held back by the fact that our export markets are the weakest growing parts of the world. Now, the UK will have to change the pattern of its exports to reflect the pattern of world economic growth if we are to stand any chance of matching world economic growth. And this reinforces the point I've made in previous lectures about the fact that the UK really needs to take the fast-growing economies seriously if we're to have any chance of achieving economic growth. the Prime Minister made an export promotion trip to India, which is a good idea and will hopefully help. But, for example, given that they have promised, they won't even make a decision about the next airport until after the next election. This highlights the mismatch between government policy and the reality of the world that we live in today. I'm afraid to say, and this is my concluding remark, we are unlikely to win much trade travelling on a slow boat to China. You've been extremely patient. Thank you very much indeed. We now reach the point where we normally have a bit of fun. Questions? Happy to answer questions. Gentleman over there, you got a hand up first, and then you, sir. And then you.
In your analysis of the cause of China's increasing savings ratio, I mean, partly it has been due undoubtedly to its rapid economic growth. Do you not think the rise of Chinese consumerism will actually have an effect upon that? And to what extent is Chinese government policy going to either encourage consumerism or suppress savings? I didn't quite understand the logic of you're saying that Chinese savings ratio will still stay high. Don't you think there will be a transitional change as consumerism takes off in China?
You've hit the heart of the subject, which is, will the savings rate stay high? The first point to make is that history is against you. I mean, even I didn't think it would rise as high as it has done. It's moved up, not down, so far. And that's despite pretty aggressive Chinese government policy to try and encourage more consumption. Remember that the savings are not just household savings. That's, I think, one of the things that people sometimes don't quite appreciate. A lot of the savings are made by corporates. And I think, in a sense, we have to look to Singapore to see what happens when the sort of changes that the Chinese government's trying to make at the moment are implemented. I mean, the Chinese government very much models itself on Singapore. I mean, to some extent, Lee Kuan Yew was the Chinese government's economic advisor. And a lot of what they're trying to do in China is copying what they've done in Singapore. It's just writ large. Now, Singapore, they've got a welfare state of a kind. They've got a health service, which is actually pretty good, and longevity there, as you probably know, is quite a lot higher than it is here, although the weather there helps a bit. And what they've done is they've got the savings ratio down by about 10 percentage points as a result of those policies. And I'm reasonably certain that what will happen in China when they reach an equivalent level of prosperity will also reduce the savings ratio down by about 10 percentage points. I don't think it will stay at 50%. I think it will certainly come down. But even at 40%, remember it's going to be 40% of a much bigger whole, it still is going to be sufficient to add to the glut of world savings. I mean, the glut of world savings, you don't actually have to shift the balance all that much. We're really talking about 3 or 4% of world GDP excess. And they can easily sustain that with a very much lower savings ratio than they have today as their economy gets bigger. And remember, it's not just China that is likely to be in a similar situation. There are ways in which it can be offset, because I've rather deliberately, to get through it all in 45 minutes, only talked about the savings side of the equation. I haven't talked about the investment side of the equation. As far as investment is concerned, if you had a sufficient rise in the investment ratio, it would obviously solve the problem. But it does appear that there are all sorts of increasing institutional obstacles to investment, one of which is that increasingly the sort of investment required is in a different country from the source of the investing funds. And it's actually much more difficult to get the funds to travel across country barriers, where you don't then have the security and legal protection that you hope to have. And a lot of the investments that are required tend to be in areas like mining and energy. Now, if you came to the second lecture, and if not, certainly on the website, Thras Moraitis from Xstrata, as it then was, Thras was really quite eloquent on why the mining companies were having so much difficulty in making the mining investments that they felt the economic situation justified. And that's quite an important part. Oil companies are in a very similar situation. And so they tend to focus more on cost reduction than on trying to get their investments up because of the difficulty in making investments in so many of the environments where it might otherwise be available. Now, in the end, we're talking about forecasts, and forecasts have been wrong before. All I can say is that we've got a reasonable track record of these things, and it's our best guess. But it's within a decent margin of error, and I don't want to pretend anything other than that. So, there's a mic coming, so wait a second.
Right, thank you for letting me ask a question. You say that China's got 2 sets of books. I'd like to... have you heard of Anthony Bolton?
I know a lot about Anthony Bolton. He's invested in companies on which I've been on
Well,
the
he
board.
ran a fund for 30 years, and I think it grew, it grew, 1,000 became 100,000. Then he set up this fund in China, and it's been a bit of a disaster. So his knowledge of how the City of London works and the American stock market works, he went into China, and it seems like the red book and the blue book, shall we say, have drowned him. So the City of London's got a lot of financial expertise, and we've got pension funds, so we probably think, we need to invest our capital wisely. You say about Chinese investing our capital wisely. We should be investing in China.
But how?
Yeah, that's
well, that's another very good question, actually. I mean, first of all, I'm actually a fan of Anthony Bolton, so I think he's a very good investor. And certainly I was found when he invested in companies where I was on the board that he was an extremely knowledgeable and very sensible individual. And as you say, he hasn't done as well in China, although I wouldn't write him off yet. He's a good learner, and even though I think he would admit that he hasn't been as successful so far, I wouldn't entirely assume that he will continue to get it wrong. If I was generally a betting man, I think I'd probably say now might not be a bad time to buy. But I'm not qualified to give investment advice, so don't take that. But I think the point you're actually making is is a rather eloquent illustration of a point that I was trying to make in answer to the previous questioner, which is it's very difficult to invest across borders. You don't have the same institutions. The expertise often is not transferable. And thundering herds that come across from one part of the world to another, so I'm probably being rude about a particular corporate by that, often don't fully appreciate the extent to which institutions operate in a different way. So I think you just have to take that on board. And that is one of the reasons why it's difficult to get world investment up at a time when you've got world savings up, which is what creates the imbalance. Now, gentleman over there, you had a question. Put hands up for the next question while we're waiting, by the way. Okay. Anyone else? Okay.
Great mistake sending emails.
Right.
No, Doug, I wondered if you could give us some perspective, your perspective, on the prospects of helicopter finance and indeed the dangers, given the fact that so far the QE measures taken in this country have done very little to stimulate demand. It appears that an awful lot has gone back into either paying down household debt or re-liquefying bank balance sheets. The idea of creating money a la Lord Turner seems so bizarre in the sense that it's so simple, that it's extraordinary that it hasn't really been tried, apart from Australia, I think, to any degree. But what's your take on it?
The question is, what's my take on helicopter money? And the question is not about low-interest finance for leasing helicopters, but it's about, it refers to a comment by Milton Friedman, who was asked, how do you get money into the hands of the population? And we said in extremis, just take a helicopter up and drop banknotes. that was not meant to be an entirely serious remark. But his point was you can get money into the hands of people. That's not the difficulty. I'm not a complete fan. I mean, first of all, let's look at the track record of QE. I'm going to deal with this in my very last Gresham lecture, by the way, because as you know, Sir Thomas Gresham is responsible for Gresham's law, and Gresham's law is that bad money drives out good. And at the end of in May 2015, I'm going to give a lecture where I look at QE in the context of Gresham's law, because I think my last lecture should pay homage to Sir Thomas Gresham, whose estate has, after all, financed these lectures. So the full answer will come then, but to sort of give you 2 years in advance a bit of a preview. First of all, I don't think QE has been as unsuccessful as some people think. I mean, the studies on it suggest that things would have been noticeably worse if we hadn't had QE. I have to remember that we have gone through the most awful economic crisis, and the fact that even things stopped falling and stayed still for 3 years thereafter, that's actually a bit of a result. I mean, it could have been noticeably worse. So I think we shouldn't just assume that because we haven't had great growth, that means that QE has failed completely. But of course there are negative effects from QE. There are negative effects from low interest rates, which affect people like pensioners, which is part of our discussion today. And I guess, looking at the age of some of the audience, I probably have 1 or 2 people who would say hear, hear to that comment. So it's not an unmixed blessing. It has a range of effects. Some are positive and some are negative. And one of the slight difficulties about the analysis that we've had so far is that quite often the people like the Bank of England have tended to look just at one side and they haven't looked at the complete range of different impacts. But my guess is it probably has made the situation less bad. I think the real difficulty comes with corporates. I think households were always bound in current circumstances to draw their horns in, and I think they'll draw their horns in whether you throw money at them or not, unless they actually think the money is there for good. Cutting taxes is more likely, actually, I think, to be seen as a permanent gain in income than anything else. But I think with corporates, their difficulty is a simple one. I mean, I run a business, and I know roughly my relationship with my bank, which I don't trust them a yard. I certainly would not want to get into a situation where they had the whip hand over me. And the only way I can ensure that is by keeping so far within my borrowing limits that there is a zero chance that I will get into trouble, that I will breach any of the covenants. And I'm pretty certain that's what other relatively small or medium-sized businessmen are doing. Large businessmen can go onto the bond market, and they've got slightly different rules affecting them. And actually, they've now got a bit of a seller's market for people trying to sell large corporate bonds. But if you're a small or medium-sized business, you're tied to your bank. And the reason you're tied to your bank is there's no competition. There are no other banks coming in who will take on your borrowing. You can't, if you go up to your bank manager and say, I'll take my overdraft elsewhere, sir, he'll look at you and he'll probably laugh. He'll probably laugh out loud, because it's not what they call, in game theory, a credible threat. And until there's competition, where you, as a businessman, know that if your bank starts messing you around, you can go and say to the bank manager, I'm sorry, I'm going to take my overdraft elsewhere. I think you're going to have to assume that corporates will be extremely cautious, and helicopter money or whatever will make relatively little difference to the rate of economic growth we have. So my remedy for that, which is also, by the way, my remedy for getting rid of the excesses of pay, is more competition. And I think the more competition we can bring into the system, within reason, because clearly you can have excess and self-defeating competition, although the market should normally blow that out. But the more competition we have within reason, I think, the more likely it is that we'll actually see people prepared to take the risk of spending, because you can never perfectly predict. I mean, we're quite good forecasters, but we can't predict what's happening. With our own corporate finances, we sometimes find we've got quite a lot more than we expected, and we sometimes find we've got quite a lot less than we expected. It's very, very difficult to predict exactly how much money you're going to have in a few months' time. And in those circumstances, therefore, you aim on the cautious side, and that is why people are very careful, because the penalty tends to be extreme. A minor breach of your covenant, and you could end up losing your entire business, getting your entire business stolen from you by the bank. And that's why people don't do it. And that's why they're so cautious. It's only competition that will keep them honest. And I think we do have to work out a way of bringing that in. And that will have many times more effect, that microeconomic reform, than the macroeconomic, than any attempt to change monetary policy by macroeconomic means. Next question, sir. We've got two more questions, one there, one there.
Good evening, Douglas. You probably know I'm not an economist and I'm not a banker, just a businessman. But it strikes me that over the years, of course, China has become the low-cost manufacturing centre of the world, and that's what's fuelled a lot of what's going on there. But of course, multinationals, higher tech multinationals, have gone out there and invested for the same reason, that in high-volume manufacturing, they can reduce their costs, but the value add is relatively low. Is there a challenge ahead in terms of intellectual property as China needs to move up in terms of IPR, ownership and technology and getting into higher technology product? They're already enforcing it through government policy whereby they're forcing people basically to transfer IPR out there. Is that going to be sustainable for shareholders in Western-owned multinationals? And could it lead to some sort of perverse trade war around IPR?
Gosh, that's a tough one. I'll give you a view, but I probably need to think to give you a very informed view. I mean, I actually think the good sign is they actually want the intellectual property rights and are prepared to try and get them legally, because that's a bit of a change for China's sake. They didn't always want to get them legally. They sometimes got them through reverse engineering and breach of patent law. I was told by the board of a major Chinese telecoms company, and I obviously shouldn't mention them by name, but you can probably guess who they are, that the balance of interest in China currently is changing because they now have so much intellectual property themselves that instead of being thieves, they're actually now looking for protection of intellectual property. However, that doesn't stop them strong-arming people into trying to give them stuff. I think this is going to be a permanent battle. I mean, the Chinese are quite tough warriors, and when they're fighting for something, they will fight quite hard. And it's not actually fighting dirty to say, if you want to do this, then you have to do that. But I suspect they're going to use their bargaining power, and I suspect that's a permanent feature that we're going to have to be prepared to live with. And you have to, if you're dealing with that kind of situation, you have to make the deal. You have to make a decision. Is the gain from being in China sufficient that you lose intellectual property? And I would suggest that your best protection, actually, is to keep 3 steps ahead, so you can keep on keep on giving them last year's technology, and keep on investing in next year's technology. That's probably the way to do it, which is, of course, typically the way that the top level of the electronics industry has tried to protect itself. But there's no perfect answer to that question. Sir.
Having looked at some of your graphs, I've gone back a little bit in history, and in the 70s and 80s, everybody was talking about UK's balance of payments. We had to have a balanced import and export regime. We didn't want to be at a deficit. That seems to have gone out of the window in recent years. So we're no longer balancing our books with the rest of the world. We're importing more than we're exporting. We then look at what's happened to money within the country. Over, say, the last 50 years, salaries in certain professional areas have probably gone up 20-fold in pound note terms. The price of the house that you would buy on those salaries has gone up roughly 100-fold. And there was somebody I heard recently saying there was more, I think it was about 1.3 trillion of debt owned by the safe high street banks and building societies in mortgages on property in UK, which is inflated. And I cannot see any future for this country where it's so much money tied up, dead, doing absolutely nothing in property. We can't balance our books. And from the scientific research I still read, there are areas now where the Chinese have left the West behind.
I think your comments are extremely thought-provoking. So can I just sort of... I won't comment on every single point because I think they're all worth thinking about. But on the balance of payments, my third lecture, which was called The New Theory of Economic Growth, specifically called for the reintroduction of balance of payments into our thinking about economic growth. Because ultimately, if you can't export, you can't pay for your imports. The idea you can permanently finance them through capital accounts is a joke. I mean, you can suck in hot money for a short period, but that will go just as quickly as it comes. And you're not going to get continued inward investment unless you're fundamentally competitive. I mean, it can tide you over, but that's about it. So the balance of payments does have to come back in, and that's what the third lecture covered. The fourth lecture picked up particularly the negative influence of the very high price of property. Now, if you look 2 rows behind you, you can see a gentleman who's one of my former bosses, a gentleman called Sir John Bannon. And Sir John, last November, I think, John issued a report about how to get house prices down to more reasonable levels. And it's a very important report for the Royal Institute of British Architects, which went into huge detail about ways of investing in social housing which could help increase the supply of housing, because the supply is desperate, and help also reduce the price of housing. And I think his report is really worthwhile reading. And if there's one thing you want to get out of this evening, I'd suggest that you read it. It's available on the web, and if you go and ask John, I'm sure he can tell you precisely where to find it. So I really recommend it, and I think you'll find that it confirms you in your current prejudice, which happens to be the same as mine. So I'm delighted to share it with you. Thank you very much, Lisa. Now, we've reached the end, and as I say, Gresham, one of the rules of Gresham, if we start on time and end on time, we do normally end up in a pub. That's the sort of rule that I have for mine. And typically we go to the Hand and Shears, which is in Smithfield. So if you follow me, we will go over there, and I will get the first round in for those who arrive in time. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you very much for your questions.